So, here we go. Okay. Good evening, good afternoon to everybody, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. I'm assuming everybody can hear me and we're all good. Okay, so we're going to discuss this week a topic that I find interesting, and I hope that you will as well. And the topic is, when did Zionism begin? Okay, so it's good. Okay, so when did Zionism begin? That's the question we're going to ask. And it's not an academic type of question that we're asking, as we're not asking just to see 1896 versus 1894, where the question is it's a leading question. It's a loaded question, and the question is aiming to understand Zionism better. It's not a historical question. We're not trying to solve a mystery of history here. Okay, this is we're going to be going to the ideology and the philosophy of Zionism to be able to understand it. That's really the idea here behind this class. And I just want to remind everybody that this is not a monologue. I don't have a script in front of me that I'm going to read off and then you just sit there and listen. This is designed to be participatory. So I would love if people had the best is if you disagree with me and tell me that you disagree with me, and then we can address and see how you're right and I'm wrong. That's the best. If you don't disagree with me and you just have something you wanna question because you're not sure, that's second best. I'm happy to explain. And if you want to add, that's great also. So as long as we keep it orderly, that should be great. And the goal here is not to convince anybody of anything. That's not our agenda. The goal is to get us thinking, okay, to challenge us and to get us thinking. And that's really all there is to it. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm sure if we ask everybody here when Zionism started, so we're going to get a bunch of different answers, right? Everybody's going to give a different answer in terms of when Zionism started. I'm almost 100% positive about it. I start calling on people, but I don't want to. What? I'll call on Ellie. Ellie, because you work for JNF and you're one of my students, so I can put you on the spot. So when do you think Zionism started?
I think Zionism started when I would say Zionism started when God told Abraham to go to the land of Israel, I guess.
Okay, great. Okay, anyone disagree? No one disagrees. Maybe nobody wants to say they
Great.
disagree. Okay, good. Okay, so Ellie, you've got the answer everybody agrees with. It's interesting that everybody agrees because usually they don't. I just think people are probably not wanting to participate here. But okay, so let's get into this and see if we can back up Ellie's opinion, but also show why it's wrong at the same time. So let's see what we can do here. So so most movements, right? I'm gonna put my notes up behind here so we could it's easier to follow. But most movements have an easily defined start date, right? A group of people got together, they were rebelling against something, there was some sort of injustice, and they got together and they said, we've got to stop this. We're going to declare our independence on this and this date, and that's the start of the movement. Or they get together for a congress or a conference, and they meet, and that's the starting point of their movement. They sign pledges of loyalty, whatever it is, and that's the start of the movement. They trace it back to that moment. And it's usually in response, movement to some sort of either injustice or perceived injustice, right? That's generally how movements begin. People are upset about what the reality is, and they want to solve that. They want to change things, and they start a movement for it. And a lot of times, what you have is you have an evolution of a movement. It doesn't necessarily get started at the same strength it's going to have when it succeeds or when it fails, right? There's an evolution, and then there's like a date that people can point to and say, yeah, when we really got started, our first idea was in this guy's basement, and that's when we started the revolution, and then it petered out at a certain point, or something along those nature, right? So that's usually how it has. Now, Zionism is an exception because there's absolutely no consensus to when the start date is. Right? Ellie says when God told Abraham. We don't know what date that was. Right? We don't know when that happened. We don't even know when that happened. Right? We know around what time that happened, but we don't know 100% when that happened. So, and if you other people, I'm sure on this call are sitting here saying Ellie's completely incorrect, and it was Herzl when Herzl started. All right, so I challenge you: when did Herzl start Zionism? Right, Herzl only lived for 44 years, so you have a wide, you don't have that many years to that you have to choose, right? But when did Herzl start his political movement? So and if you're going to say Herzl was the start of Zionism, well then you're gonna have other problems, because if you say it was Herzl that started Zionism, well there were Zionists before Herzl, right? And are you going to say that Zionism includes or doesn't include, the Christian movement of Restorationism, which was a movement to get Jews back to Israel, right? That Abraham Lincoln was a proponent of that movement. So you're going to cancel that out and say that wasn't part of it. It's very, very difficult. So I'm sure everybody can understand where I'm coming from when I say that there's no clear consensus as to when Zionism began. Okay, and then I want to again stress that this is not a class in Zionist history, right? We're not having a lecture on Zionist history. Our goal is not to understand really the start date of Zionism. The start date of Zionism is really mostly inconsequential to us. It's not going to affect our lives. It's not going to affect really anything that we know about Israel or about Zionism. But what happened, the way we define the start of Zionism, right? The way that we're going to define that is going to help us understand what Zionism is, because Ellie's understanding of Zionism with Abraham is going to be much different than someone that stands up and says Zionism really starts with Herzl. They're not arguing in terms of when Zionism really started. They're arguing as to what Zionism is all about. That should be a point as we go through this, that's clear with everybody. Okay, good. Any questions to this point? Anybody disagree with anything I said? We're all good? Okay. Let's move on here. Okay, now Zionism, like any good movement, has opponents, right? We've got people that don't agree with us and don't like us. Zionism is interesting in that it doesn't just have opponents; it has enemies. Okay, there's a difference between an opponent and an enemy. Yeah, I don't mean to bring up. I always say this when I talk. I don't mean to bring up modern politics, but Republicans and Democrats are not enemies. Likud and Labor are not enemies. They're opponents. They both care about their respective countries. They both want the best for their respective countries, but they oppose each other on how the country will be best. Right? So that they're not enemies of each other. They're opponents. Zionism has actual enemies. You have enemies of Zionism that want the Zionist dream, that want the Zionist ideology and the Zionist state to be finished. They do not want that to happen. That's not an opponent. That's an enemy, right? They're not disagreeing as to how to have Zionism. They are not just opposed to our pathways on Zionism. They are enemies of Zionism. Okay, and these enemies of Zionism, so they claim that the movement is very modern in nature, right? And so what's their angle? Where are they coming from? They're not, again, let's make sure we're clear on this. Zionist enemies and those that oppose Zionism are not Zionist scholars, right? They're not going to come to Ellie and be like, Ellie, I studied Zionism for years, and we must admit that Zionism got its start with Herzl. That's not where they're coming from. They have an agenda. So I've quoted two of Zionism's enemies here. This is Tariq Dana and Ali Jabari. These are professors, and they're professors here in Israel. They probably wouldn't call themselves professors in Israel, but that's what they are. And they say the following. They say, throughout the past century, the Zionist movement constructed the most sophisticated settler colonial project of our age, State of Israel. The violent birth of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent colonization of the entirety of the land of Palestine after the 1967 war are indeed reflections of Zionism's success in fulfilling its settler colonial ambitions in Palestine, right? So they view, these two professors, how are they viewing Zionism? As a very modern movement, Yeah, what's the objection? What's their angle? Their angle is to, by calling it modern, they're able to peg it into a certain time period, which is that of modern colonial settler type of a movement, which is meaning that it's coming to take somebody else's land. It's not a movement of justice. It's in fact a movement of injustice. It's coming like so many other colonial projects came to take somebody else's land, whether that would be in the Middle East or whether it would be in Africa or whether it would be in South America or at a certain point even in North America, right, where you had people that went to take other people's lands. So by calling it a modern movement, by saying that it only recently again, in America and in the West, everything has to be solved in 22 minutes. 22 minutes is the length of the average sitcom, right? And everything has to be solved within that time. For those of you that remember, before there was binge watching of shows that you could watch like 8 straight shows in a row, when shows would only come out once a week and you had to wait to the next week, the worst thing you could see at the end of an episode of a show was to be continued. Because then you'd go crazy the whole week wondering what's going to happen, right? So you need, the West needs all problems solved within that 22-minute window. If it's not solved in that 22-minute window, it creates incredible frustration. Here in the Middle East, we think different. We don't think about 22-minute windows. We think about 1,000 years. The Jewish people were out of Israel for 2,000 years, and then we came back. That's an enormity in the Western mind. The Western mind can't even handle, can't grasp 2,000 years of what it means for a people to think one thing and to have hopes for one thing. They don't understand what that means to have 2,000 years like that. In the Middle East, we can start a project and wait 1,000 years for it. So 150 years is nothing, right? That's so modern. That's lacking of all history, lacking of all rights, because you're immature. You're as a movement. You're an immature movement because you're so young. So therefore, when Dana and Jarbawi here come along and have their points on Zionism and say it's a modern movement, what they're really doing is undermining the movement. They're saying the movement has no justification. The movement is unjust because it's a modern movement. It's just another group of people coming in, and pardon me for saying it, but a group of white men coming in, taking away the indigenous people who are, in their case, that they would claim is the Palestinians' land. Because it's a modern movement, and they don't recognize Zionism as older than 150 years. To them, that's all it is. Any objections, questions, points of clarification, additions anybody wants to throw in here? Okay, that's my metric of a good lecture is where people are arguing with me. So either have to get a little more controversial in this series or do something else here. But okay, so as a movement, right? Herzl, for those of us that have studied modern Zionism, so it had a slow start, right? Herzl was not the most popular guy in the room for his entire life. I don't know what he was like as a child. Maybe in his childhood he experienced popularity. But as an adult with Zionism, nobody really liked Herzl. 95% of world Jewry, forget about everybody else, 95% of world Jewry rejected Zionism out of hand. They thought, they had so many different objections to it. Many religious Jews had objections to it because they thought it would be a distraction from a religious lifestyle. So the values is completely corrupt. You had many wealthy Jews who felt that we'd be rocking the boat in the countries that we were in and be accused of dual loyalty if we started talking about a movement of moving our people back. How could you be a good German? How could you be a good Frenchman if your goal was to move to Palestine? How could that work? So Herzl, was fighting the good fight and trying to get the message across, but was widely rejected, which is why it's so surprising that he was actually successful and that we have a state of Israel, because the Jews didn't want it. Jews rejected him. So it slowly started getting popular, but at that point, Herzl was long dead. Right, at that point, Herzl was gone. He never got to see the tremendous success. When we look at pictures of the Zionist Congress, like in Switzerland, right, Basel, Switzerland, and we look at this and we say, "Wow, look at that room! It's so exciting." There was like 600 people in the room. Think about the APAC conferences of today, right, or of yesterday, right? That were 18,000 people in a room. If Herzl would have walked into an APAC conference in Washington, D.C., he'd be flabbergasted. 18,000 people not living in a modern state of Israel who are pro-Israel enough to travel to Washington for a huge conference, right? Herzl would never have imagined such a thing. He couldn't picture it. Imagine what would happen if he saw the state of Israel, right? I imagine the first thing he would have said if he saw the state of Israel would be, "I told you so." But that's it's an amazing thing. So the goal was to establish a Jewish state in what was then called Palestine, right? And but the objective, much different than what we talk about today. Herzl's main objective, his main motivation, was to save Jews from anti-Semitism. Again, we say it over and over. I must say this line 10 times a day. Herzl did not know a Holocaust was coming because nobody could imagine such a nightmare. But he understood something at a different level that had ever happened before was about to happen. That he understood. So he knew that European Jewry was doomed, and they needed something to save them. And the only thing that would work would be their own state, and that state should be in Palestine. So that was the early Zionists' real motivation. That's what they were working towards. They were working towards a state that could protect from anti-Semitism. This was what early Zionism was about. Now, they ascribed to the idea that the Jewish people have a right to their own land, to what was then Palestine, but to historic Eretz Yisrael. Of course, they believed that, and that's why they were moving towards that way. But Herzl's main motivation, if you had sat down with Theodor Herzl and said, "What's the rush? It's been 2,000 years. Why are you so adamant that this has to happen now?" He would not have answered you because it's our right and nobody should tell us to slow down. That would not have been his answer. His answer would have been because doomsday is coming, and we need to find a place where Jews can determine their own future, can defend themselves, and have a place of refuge where they could go to. That was the motivation of the modern state of the modern political Zionist movement. Okay, before I switch the slide here, any objections? Any questions for clarification? Anything you want to add? Okay, Mark says, Western Jewry doomed. One day we'll talk about it. It's a good question about today. Mark asks, is today is modern, again, and none of us are prophets. And so we don't know for sure if, what the future has in store for anybody, right? We don't know. Nobody can tell you for sure what's going to happen. But one thing is for certain, right? We can look at the way historical trends are when we're in other lands, and we can look at what the benefits of the land of Israel have been. That's all we can do. But we can't predict the future, right? That's I think that's definitely not my game that I'm in, right? To predict the future. That would not be a smart thing. Okay. A lot of text here. Mike, yeah, go ahead, Mike, sure.
Why did Herzl feel that way? Why did Herzl think that doomsday was coming?
It's a great question. Because what Herzl saw was, everybody likes to assume that it was the Dreyfus affair that got Herzl mad, right? That he was a journalist covering the Dreyfus affair. It's as if Herzl was this naive guy, felt that the Jews had everything going for them. And then he walks into the trial and he said, "Whoa, what's happening here?" And then all of a sudden, everything changes for Herzl. That's not, give the guy a little credit. Right, so of course he saw the anti-Semitism before he got to the trial. The trial wasn't a shock to him in the sense of, wow, there's anti-Semitism in the world. He couldn't believe at the trial how blatant it was. He couldn't believe how obvious it was to everybody in the room that Dreyfus was innocent. Everybody knew in the room that he was innocent. This wasn't a question. It was obvious. And then there was across the street, there's crowds screaming, "Execute the Jew." So it's, and what was amazing to him was nobody was saying anything. Nobody was objecting. Nobody was saying, "Hey, this is a farce," right? This is all anti-Semitic. Everybody was following along. Then he saw the pogroms in Eastern Europe, in Poland and in Russia. And he started seeing that even where Jews were fitting in in the cosmopolitan areas in the cities of Paris and London, right, and all the main places of Europe where the intellectuals were, he saw that Jews were not on even footing. He saw that there was this underlying current that had always been there in Europe of anti-Semitism, and he watched it rise. He watched it rise, and he watched the tolerance for it rise. So those things led him to believe that this was a trend. It was a trend that was going up, right? And yes, things in Atlanta, 100%, right? So and America was also experiencing. I don't think he was so worried about things around the world, but Europe was his main concern. I don't know how aware he was of anti-Semitism in Arab lands, right? And that I'm not sure, right? Arab lands were also experiencing tremendous anti-Semitism and had been for hundreds of years. But Herzl definitely in Europe, Herzl saw in Eastern Europe, he saw a rising trend of violent anti-Semitism. So yeah, if you would show Herzl the Holocaust and say, "Is this what you meant?" He couldn't say, "Yeah, I never would have imagined something so bad." But did he imagine something bad enough that he felt that all of European Jewry should flee? 100%. It was unquestionable. Sure. Thank you for the question. So Herzl starts his modern political movement in the late 1800s, right? But the idea of Zionism, right, not just the anti-Semitism aspect of it, that we need a place of refuge, okay, which is if you just look at Zionism as trying to find a place of refuge for the Jewish people and don't get into the second aspect that we're about to start here about rights, so then you're not really talking about Zionism. What you're really trying to do is undermine the legitimacy of the state of Israel and the Zionist movement, because you're saying it's all about anti-Semitism and Jews don't really have that right. So that would be that's very problematic. So here you have, right, the movement starts with a fear of anti-Semitism, but seeks to establish a Jewish state because our history of the Jewish people are on that state for thousands of years, or on that land for thousands of years. And that's why they're looking. I mean, why look at Palestine? Why there's a ton of other places that Jews could have said, let's start a movement to move there, right? The reason why we're going to Palestine is because our history, that's what we look at it and say, that's Eretz Israel. That's the land of Israel. That's where we should be. So, right, we look back and we say that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, these were our first ancestors, right? And they spent their years, right, their main years of their life in the land of Israel and establishing the land of Israel for their children, right? Abraham doesn't take the cave, what we call today the cave of the patriarchs and the matriarchs in Hebron. He doesn't take that as a gift. He wants to purchase it because he wants to put roots down in the ground. This is ours. This area of the land is ours. And he starts walking around the land. And he's walking around this land, this barren land at the time of Abraham, and he's walking it around and saying, okay, this is going to be our spot, and this is going to be our spot, and this is, right, Abraham had a family, and he had a movement behind him of tens of thousands of students, and he starts saying, this is going to be our land. And a couple hundred years later, when Moses and Joshua return to the land, right, Moses takes them up to the border, Joshua takes them over the border, right, when they return, so that's, right, so that now you have roots in the land that go back over 3,000 years. Right, so now, right, they led the Jewish people to this spot, and we start conquering the land from the Canaanite people that lived there, right? And then we have a history there. We govern it for over 1,000 years. We go all the way. This is past King David and King Solomon, right, building up Jerusalem and then the temple. Okay, and then they're briefly exiled by the Babylonians, and then return. Right, that was a 70-year exile. Right, and there were still Jews in the land, and Jews obviously felt connected to the land. And then they return and create a second commonwealth for over 400 years. Right, and that's the time of the Second Temple. This is Ezra and Nehemiah building up the second temple, and now you have, right. This is they go through the Greeks, right. They survive the Greeks, and then they're up until the Romans, right. And the Romans, almost 2,000 years ago, they conquer the land, exile some of the people. And for the most part, a lot of our people over the course of the next 600 years start leaving the land, right? They start exiling out of the land, and until Arabs come in, in the 700s, and that seals the exile. At that point, the Arabs are, you need to leave, right? Arab marauders come in, and then they become Muslim. Islam begins, and this is the end of the major Jewish presence in the land of Israel. We'll always have a small community in the land of Israel, right? That's always going to be there. But the Jewish people are, for the most part, in exile, in a diaspora, outside the land of Israel. But 3 times a day, they're praying to go back to Israel. At the end of, we know that at the end of the Pesach Seder and the end of Yom Kippur, they're saying next year in Jerusalem, right? We're always looking back to Jerusalem. Every Jew, when they pray towards Jerusalem, and they're saying, okay, that's home. This is where we might live outside of the land of Israel, but the land of Israel is always going to be the home of the Jewish people. And that has never ended. The Jewish people have never said, right, this is it, we're done, right? You might have had individual Jews, you might have had a movement here or there of Jews that have said, that's no longer our connection to that place. Those movements, interestingly enough, changed their philosophy, and now all believe that the state of Israel is, and the land of Israel is their home. But right, this is the idea that the land of Israel isn't ancillary to the Jewish people, but it is an integral part of who the Jewish people are. This is who we are. We're connected to our land. It's why, right, we're not really Jews. We're really Israelites, right? That's the more accurate term for us because we come from Israel. We became Jews when we switched the name Israel to Judea, right? So that was one inaccuracy leads to another inaccuracy. But if we move backwards in time, we'll find that we really are Israelites because we have this connection to the land. So when you count Zionism, if we look back at what we started with here, and we remember those our enemies, what they say when they talk about Zionism as a modern movement, right? And especially if they call it a colonial settler movement, right? So not only is it inaccurate, but what it's doing is it's taking the millions of Jews that worked so hard, right, for a Jewish state, and all of the rights that they spoke about that we have rights to be in this land, and what they're doing is they're trying to undermine it and they're trying to overturn it, and they're trying to put a black mark on Zionism and say this is a movement of injustice. It's a movement of colonialism. It's a movement that comes and takes over for indigenous people by people who have no right to be there. And it's an injustice that has to be corrected. That's the language of our enemies. That's what they say. And the way they get away with it is by pointing to a Herzl and saying that Herzl is a modern movement. He's the modern leader of Zionism. Look who the Jews have pictures of hung up, right? What are they going to say? They have pictures of Herzl hung up, right? And they have Herzliya, and they Har Herzl, and they have all these things dedicated to Herzl because he's really the beginning of Zionism. We're saying that no, that's not what it was. The early Zionist movement, the early Zionist movement is really just coming along. The early Zionist movement is coming along in order to fulfill the dreams of 2,000 years, and really the dreams of close to 4,000 years when we go back to Abraham, right? That's the idea. Herzl, Nordau, Jabotinsky, Weizmann, Ben Gurion, everybody that we talk about, all the early Zionist leaders, these are not, none of them walked around and said, I have a great idea, right? I have a novel approach to Judaism that no one has ever thought of before. Israel. What do you guys think? Right? That wasn't their approach. They never boasted about the fact that Israel was their idea. They always looked back and said, this was our land. This is who we are, right? It's an integral part of us. So telling us that Zionism, when we say, when did Zionism begin? And saying that Zionism began in the late 1800s is not only inaccurate, right? But it's devious, because what it's trying to do is redefine Zionism as an unjust movement that has no legitimacy whatsoever and needs to be ended. So you could say that the modern political movement of Zionism began in the late 1800s. That's true. But to say that Zionism as an ideology, which is, maybe one day we'll have a lecture on whether Zionism is a movement or an ideology. But Zionism as an ideology, right, that started thousands and thousands of years ago, like Elliot said in the beginning, when God tells Abraham, it's time to go. right? You've got to go and keep walking until I tell you where to stop. And that's where he landed in the land of Israel. So what we're doing here with the Zionist movement, I don't mean this lecture, but I mean the total Zionist movement. What we're doing is we're fulfilling dreams of thousands of years and millions of our people who are here now and are long gone. That's the Zionist movement. It is an age-old movement because it's an age-old movement built on an idea. I wrote something up interesting, and please don't take this as American politics. I'm not getting involved in American politics, but one of my personal enjoyments is anything presidential. So one of my favorite nights of the year is the State of the Union address. I love it. I don't care. The president can get up and recite poetry, and I wouldn't care. I love it. I don't care which president it is. I love the pomp and circumstance of the whole evening, and I love how lately the American Congress is becoming more and more like the Knesset, where it's becoming more and more acceptable to scream out and yell. It's adding a whole new feature to the State of the Union. Maybe not everybody agrees with me that they like it, but let me put it this way: I find it entertaining at least. So the President Biden, said something at the end of the State of the Union address, which is fascinating, and it's not in. If you look up the text of the speech, I found this fascinating. I don't know how much you know about this, but the text of the speech is released before the speech, and then a different text is released after the speech. So the before the speech is what they plan on having him, what the president's going to say, and then after is what he actually said. This was not in the text of the speech that was released before. It was only he said it, and it was released afterwards, obviously because he said it, but it wasn't before. And he talks about at the end of the State of the Union address, he talks about how America is a unique nation, as the only nation in the history of the world built on an idea. Right? Built on an idea. While every other nation is built, he said, on a geographical location or an ethnicity. Right? I almost drove off the road. I had it playing in the car, and Jerusalem was rainy, and I almost drove off the road. I said, "What is he talking about?" But first of all, I fault him, and I'll tell you why. Because President Biden, whether you like his policies or not, defines himself as a Zionist. He said it many, many times. So I think he has to come to these lectures, because he has to understand that there was a nation before the American nation that was built on an idea, and that's us, right? We're the Jewish people. We're a nation, and we were built on an idea, right? That was first and foremost. But we also have an integral part of our being, of our nation, is also geographical location. So it could be that's where he gets a little mixed up on the issue and thinks that America's not. But that's I would love to ask him. My Talmudic mind goes to and say, I would love to ask President Biden, if America could continue, but not in the land of the United States of America, it would have to move somewhere else. Would you still consider that America? If his answer is yes, then he knows what he's talking about. If his answer is of course not, we'll never give up the United States, then he's just like everybody else. Yeah. So again, the point that I'm trying to make here has nothing to do with President Biden. It has to do with the idea that Zionism, the movement, is an integral part of who our people are, and it's thousands and thousands of years old. So when Zionism began, the only correct answer you have to say, and as long as we're speaking about the ideology, is that it started thousands of years ago, and the political movement was just putting power and action into creating that ideology into a concretized, solidified, dream that actually came true in a land that created a wonderful state. And so Mark asked with a Chashmonaim Zionists. So I think you'd have to say that any Jew that ascribed to Judaism, which is essentially anybody that we know, right, in our history, right, because anybody else we don't know about them. They disappeared off the face of the earth, and nobody writes about them. But I don't know if you'd call them Zionists. They definitely ascribe to the ideology that we call Zionism today. I'll say that, right? If you would ask them, a Maccabee and say, "Do you think the Jews have the right to the land of Israel?" Right? I have a great quote. Can I read you a quote? I'm going to read you a quote. I have it on my phone. It is amazing. It's worth the 3 seconds it's going to take me to find it. Hold on. Okay. Now, as I'm reading this quote to you, I want you to think to yourself, 1 second. Where is this? Oh, no, hold on. As I'm reading this quote, I want you to think to yourself, who said this? Who was the Zionist that said this? Okay, but I don't know where I'm gonna find it. Hold on. I thought I had it right here. Give me 1 second. Maybe I do. Ah, here it is. Okay, it was worth it. Trust me. You ready for this quote? Here we go. Okay. Now, this is recorded, so if you want to take notes on this quote, or you can email me and I'll send it to you afterwards, okay? But listen to this. This is going to blow your minds. You ready for this one? Listen to this quote. It's worth it for the whole lecture just for this moment right here. We have neither taken foreign land nor seized foreign property, but only the inheritance of our fathers, which at one time had been unjustly taken by our enemies. Now that we have the opportunity, we are firmly holding the inheritance of our fathers. Which Zionist leader said that? What do you think? You could type it in, you could say it. Go ahead. What do you say? Best guess, Zionist leader that said it. If you follow me on social media, you're not allowed to answer. Okay, so Mike says Ben Gurion. Okay, safe bet. Anybody else? Don't be shy. You can give it. Nothing happens if you get it wrong. You're still invited back next week. Okay, Ellie says he can't answer. Not even a guess. Okay. Mark says John Adams. Very creative. Okay. Here we go. You guys ready? This is gonna blow your mind. Shimon the Maccabee. Okay. Simon the Maccabee. Yeah, look at Mike's face. Exactly. There you go. Simon the Maccabee said that. Sounds like somebody from this generation or maybe last generation. It's not. It's Simon the Maccabee fighting. He said it to Antiochus, the head of the Greeks, right? Now, Shimon the Maccabee, you should just know, close to my heart, because he was assassinated about a 10-minute drive from where I'm sitting right now in my home. Okay, but, right, Shimon the Maccabee says that line, an amazing line, right? So, Mark, if you talk about, right, were the Maccabee Zionists, I mean, come on. Listen to that quote. Right, that's an absolutely amazing quote, and I think that nothing could answer your question better than that. So so if anybody has anything they want to say before we end, now's your chance. But if not, then we're gonna end here, and I'll see everybody next week. Okay, everybody should have a Shabbat Shalom from Israel.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
Bye bye.